Right. Good afternoon for those that have joined already. I won't kind of keep interrupting as people join. We'll keep going with the flow. This afternoon really is to give an introduction to 1000D. I know some of you are already using it. Hopefully there will at least be some points in here that are beneficial, even if you already kind of know what S1000D is about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the spec itself, and I'm also going to try and look at some of the things you would need to consider when starting out in S1000D from a kind of project perspective rather than actually the standard itself. So as we've mentioned, this is recording. If we can, I'd like to try and keep questions to the end. There'll be plenty of time at the end of the presentation to do questions. If you have got a question and you want to note it down in chat so we don't forget it as we go along, that's cool, and we'll try and pick those up at the end as well. But what I'll do is I'll run through the presentation. I've got a few slides to kind of work through, and as I say, we can open it up for some Q&A and see how we get on. So just a little bit about me to start with, because it's always all about me. My name is Steve Cripps. I was a pilot in the Royal Air Force for about 20 years, although part of that time I spent at a little outfit called Handling Squadron, where we used to write all the aircrew information, all the flight reference cards and aircrew manuals. And that's really how I got into technical documentation. Through that, I got involved in S1000D, and I've been doing that since about the year 2000, which seems an awful long time ago now. But I spent time as the chair of the Air Pubs Working Group, and that was at a particular time when we were bringing aircrew information more into the standard, because it started out very much from a maintainer point of view. And over time, it's grown to include the operator information and so on as well. I left the Air Force in 2009, and since then I've been contracting in and around the tech pubs world. And then Mekon I've known for years. Mekon actually used to do my software for me when I was still in the Air Force, when I was at Handling Squadron. And that's kind of when the relationship began. And then a couple of years ago now, I came on board as the customer support manager. So one of my main goals really is the sort of the main technical lead for all the S1000D programs, but I also obviously look after a lot of the customer facing stuff. And those of you that already have a relationship with us will know me and will have chatted with me on many occasions. Just a wee bit about Mekon as well then, you know, and why we're here and why we're talking to you about this. So Mekon has been around since 1990. We've got about 30 staff across the business as a whole. And we have, as well as the aerospace and defence team, we have a sort of Mekon, what we call Mekon Centre, which deals in a lot of language programs, taxonomies, works with government, pharmaceuticals, that kind of big tech industry. And we also have another specialist division called Congility that work and have a platform based around DITA. And so we actually have some customers where maybe S1000D isn't so appropriate, but they need structured content, and then DITA is a good fit. So we have expertise right across the board of sort of structured information. On the A&D side, then really we all come from a background of many years working with and around both military and aerospace. And as an industry, we do have those kind of unique requirements of very high levels of governance, very high levels of security, both, you know, of our information, but also in the way in which we use our information. And so we can bring that sort of years of knowledge to the table and understand where you're coming from, as well as, you know, knowing what the specifications and so on require. Generally, Mekon is technology independent. So most of the tools and so on that we have, we write ourselves. We create all our own code. What we do have is a set of relationships in terms of things like Adobe and so on, where we create plugins for those tools. But I'll talk more about that in a wee while. One thing to note is that we've recently been acquired by Contium. Contium is a large group worldwide now. So the main office is in the States, and then we have offices in Europe, in India, and in Australia. And the nice thing for us at Mekon is that's actually brought a whole load more resource to us, and it's meant that we can actually take on some more projects and reach out in new exciting directions. There's things that we've been wanting to do, for example, with our platforms for a while, that this is now starting to afford us the ability to move into. We've always had a philosophy at Mekon of trying to understand the customer requirement first, and then the solution needs to fit that requirement. There's no point us having a set of tools and trying to shoehorn you and your business, which is much bigger than us, into our tools. So we would much rather engage with you, understand your needs and your requirements first, and then start putting together a solution that's going to support and enable that, rather than trying to make you do something that doesn't fit your business profile. For S1000D, we have kind of three main strands, what we call create, manage, deliver, which is the life cycle of your tech pubs. So on the creation side, we have these authoring extensions at the moment for FrameMaker and Arbortext. We are just in the process of producing a new extension, which is quite exciting, for Oxygen, which will give us a much lighter weight platform compared to the other two. But all three of those eventually will form our creation side of S1000D life. We then have the manage, which is our Notice Cstb. And part of this talk today will be talking about the governance requirements and the load that S1000D can create if you're not careful about how you use it. And that's one of the things that we want to avoid from a kind of project perspective. And then finally, there's the delivery arm of publishing. And despite the fact that S1000D is designed really around electronic publishing, one of the big problems is that many of our customers still want some form of traditional manual, whether that's a PDF kind of lookalike of a printed manual or actually paper itself. And where you have S1000D based around modules, it's often quite difficult to then, how do we stick all those modules back together and create a traditional manual? And I'm not going to look too much at that today, because that's one of the talks that we're going to do in a couple of weeks' time. But it is worth bearing these concepts in mind. And again, just a reminder of some of the third-party technology that we do work with. Obviously, Adobe and PTC on the editing side. Say Oxygen hopefully will be out there soon as well. Antenna House is a superb print engine. So our print solution uses Antenna House to turn all the XML through XSLFO into a PDF, and it's really quick, which is the beauty of it. And so you can churn out a several hundred page manual. And in fact, James has had experience of using this, the difference it made from the old system using kind of FrameMaker and using FrameMaker files compared to the new solution using Antenna House and churning out an entire PDF in a very short space of time. So enough about me and about Mekon. You guys are here for S1000D. So what is S1000D? Well, in their own words, they are an international specification for technical publications using a common source database, which is quite long-winded. But if you break it down into kind of logical elements, then actually it's not that complicated. International specification, yes, they are a global standard. And one of the good things about S1000D, it has very good adherence. So people that use the standard tend to use it solidly. They don't pick and choose. They don't kind of do some of it to the standard and do some of it to their own guidelines, if you like. Technical publications, that's what this is all about, whether that's maintenance manuals, operation manuals, maybe it's some of the supporting stuff like illustrated parts lists, wiring diagrams, wiring schedules. And yes, it started life in aerospace. It actually came out of Europe in the 80s when they were building the Tornado aircraft, and various different European manufacturers were working together in a consortium, realized they needed a way to exchange information. And that's kind of where S1000D came from in the first place. They decided if they actually use structure, they use some common elements, then they could exchange this information between each other. And in time, it's moved on. It is used in the rail industry. It's used in the shipping industry. It's used in the automotive industry. And Anything else really, anything where you need some kind of structured approach to managing and maintaining information, S1000D has potential. I mentioned tax on there. There was an interesting case study that was done by IRS in the States, that because they changed so many tax rules every year, they didn't want to have to rewrite the entire set of tax rules. And so a modularized approach allowed them to amend the many elements that had changed, but then still rapidly republish the next year's rules and the next year's rules and so on. And then finally, the common source database bit. The common source database gets a lot of bad press and a lot of confusion by people understanding what it is or what it isn't. S1000D doesn't define what a common source database is. It just defines some of the concepts that it needs to support. And basically, your common source database is a big bucket of all of your information. Now, what makes it different between different vendors, and there are many out there, is kind of both the way that the common source database works from a user perspective, how to navigate the system, how to find the information you need, how to manage the information, and then also in terms of the underlying system, the controls and the governance and the history and so on that can be applied using all the stuff that's baked into the data in the first place. And we will talk an awful lot more about the common source database in the third session, where we look at the whole information management and governance. So that's the kind of, if you like, the high level description. What does that mean under the hood? So S1000D is based on XML, and I am taking it as read that pretty much everyone here at least has heard of XML and understands what XML is. It's a markup language. All of our data is stored as plain text, and then we use a system of tags to create elements, and those elements in effect are containers for our content. And by using this structure, we can actually provide intelligence to our content. We were talking earlier today in the office about some potential conversion work and the difficulty of getting from an unstructured piece of information to something with structure. In the unstructured world, the only thing that provides any kind of interpretation of what the contents means is the words themselves. But a computer, certainly at the moment, maybe in a few years with the advances in AI and ChatGPT and everything else, maybe in the future the computer will actually start to understand what the words mean. But for now, we have to give it a helping hand, and by adding those elements and those tag structures, we can give it intelligence. The computer can then understand that a title has a special meaning. And that special meaning might be how it's output to the end user. So it might be a different formatting, a different appearance, or it might be something internally in terms of some process that the computer needs to do to maybe branch and display a different set of information depending on circumstance. So early versions of S1000D were in SGML. SGML is just an older markup language, and SGML is still around today and still valid today. It's just that we can do an awful lot more with XML and even different flavors of XML. The difference between a DTD, which is a document type definition, versus a schema. So all the modern versions from 4.0 onwards have been schema based. You can download S1000D. You can go to their website and you download a gigantic zip file that contains all sorts of things. So it contains all those XML schemas. It contains all the schema documentation, and then there's all sorts of other things in there, like the bike data set. And over these series of talks, and if you've come across S1000D before, you'll be well aware of the bike data set. It's a way of basically showing how S1000D works without using anything, anyone's proprietary information or anything that's potentially classified. So they built a bike virtually and documented it. We're going to talk a little bit today about business rules, and some of you may or may not have heard of the term Brex. Another term that will come around an awful lot is SNS, the standard numbering system, and so on. The specification document itself these days is about 3,500 pages long. and that's an awful big bedtime read. And so it pays to go and get help from people that understand S1000D in the first place if you are thinking of moving into it, because there's an awful lot of pitfalls. If you, for example, get your SNS wrong or you get your Brex wrong, then that can have a big impact on your success in S1000D. And by the way, it's free. And I put a little caveat on it. It says, assuming you're in the right club. The actual copyright statement for S1000D says it's freely available to members of partner companies. So I think for pretty much everyone online today, we're either in the North Americas, USA, Canada, or we're in the UK, and all of us are partner companies, partner countries of S1000D. So you can download it, you can use it. There is no cost implication involved in that. Very quick look at the release history, and I won't kind of labor this too much, but it is worth understanding, you know, both the pedigree and some of the major changes. When it started out, it was known as change 1 and then change 2 and so on. The first publicly available change was was change 6, and they went up to 9, and this was all in SGML. And then somebody said, well, look, we really need to be doing XML. And so what they did was said, right, we're going to go back, we're going to start now with issue 2, and we're going to have XML alongside SGML. And so retrospectively, they turned all the change 6, 7, 8, 9 into 1.6, 1.7, and so on. After 2.3, we had a fairly major leap because the Civil Air Working Group got involved. So up to the issue 2 series, it was still very heavily a military specification. And most of the work that was done was to provide for the requirements of the military world. With Civil Air being heavily involved, certainly at the committee level, they needed to add more structures and mechanisms to S1000D to cope with the requirements for civil aviation and the civil air industry. And so issue 3 was a big leap really to bring those civil elements into the spec. We then jumped to issue 4 because at that point we went to a totally XML schema-based design. We got rid of all the SGML, and part of that major restructuring included a significant renaming of all the elements. Up to that point, virtually all the elements had kept the same name throughout all of those issues. It made it reasonably easy to move between issues if you had to upgrade from, say, 1.8 to 2.1 or whatever. When we went to 4, everything got renamed and everything became a purely XML standard. The drawback, obviously, is it's less backward compatible. The benefits is that you gain from use of pure XML. Issue 5 came out, it's actually nearly 4 years ago now. It came out at the end of 2019, and then we had COVID, and that has delayed things. So Suzanne and I were out at the S1000D user forum earlier this year in Seattle. They are now talking about 6.0. And moving forward, they're talking about not having any more sort of dotted versions. So we're not going to get a 5.1 and a 5.2. We're going to go straight to 6 and then straight to 7 and so on. And that's the way they're going to manage it going forward. They are trying desperately at the moment to speed up the iteration process, because one of the reasons for keep changing versions is because people put in change requests. They say, I would like this feature or facility. The committees look at it, they decide whether that's a good idea, and they decide how and when it's going to be implemented. Now, all of that process takes time, and so they are trying to find ways to speed that up so that people get the changes they need a little bit quicker. So just a couple of notes on there as to what was SGML and XML, and also the way that the amendments were numbered. So up to issue 3, we added a further .1. So, for example, there's a 1.8.1, which has some slight technical amendments. After issue 4, we then went to a dot letter. So there's a 4.0.A and a 4.0.B and so on. S1000D is owned. So, in the sense of who can use it, it's down to these guys. It was originally AECMA, AECMA is the Aerospace Industries of Europe, and it's a French acronym, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because we've got Canadians online and they'll do a far better job at the French than I will. But AECMA became ASD, Aerospace Defence Europe, in 2004. And in 2008, they signed an MOU with both the AIA and the ATA to jointly work on and progress S1000D. And it was really that big MOU signing that led to issue 3 and the inclusion of all the civil air requirements. These 3 parent companies hold the joint copyright between them. They own the standard, and they provide all the core members of the S1000D Council, which is the group that has the top level strategic management of S1000D. And I'm not going to go into today's session, but there are various kind of lower level committees and working groups that do all the sort of day-to-day tactical level. What are we going to include in the next version of the spec? Who's working on what? The guys that do the XML coding, the guys that manage and maintain the website, the actual specification book itself, and so on. S1000D itself is actually part of a much larger series. It's now known as the S series. And again, there's been a few name changes lately. So we used to talk about integrated logistics support, ILS. That in the last few years has become integrated product support and is now known as IPS. But basically the whole of the S series are designed around providing all the information you need to support a major kind of platform level project. So we're talking an aircraft or a ship or a vehicle, train, whatever. The different parts of the specification, the different thousands, if you like, so 2000M, 3000L, 4000P, all look at different aspects of the kind of information management and logistics management, parts management that you need. And then down at the end there, we've got things like 5000F and 6000T, which provide both sort of feedback mechanisms and training analysis and design. And all of these integrate together. So, for example, 6000T does the training analysis and design, but they still use S1000D documentation to actually create the training data modules. And some of you may have heard of a standard called SCORM, the Shareable Content Object Reference Model, which is a way of writing training information that can then be delivered by a training management system. So it will take the user through a series of courses, online training. It will capture their success and their marks and store that back in the system. And then training managers can work out what additional training they need and remedial and so on. So all of these integrate together. There are a few tentative steps to try and use, for example, 2000M material management, so your parts information, and 3000L the logistics support, so the engineering instructions and so on, and actually automate the interchange of information between these and the documentation. We are making some inroads into this at Mekon. We've been looking at this as ways of exchanging that kind of information. We've been working with a few different IPS vendors that have kind of content management, database management, materials management systems, and how we can exchange information. At a base level, you have things like, lists of spares and tools and parts that your authors can then just select from a list in their documentation rather than having to type things in and maybe make mistakes in part numbers and so on. And then at a higher level, you get things like automated updates. So if my part changes in my logistics support or my material parts, then can I knock on that change into my technical documentation? And I will talk more about that when we do some of the material management in the third session, because there are various different governance aspects that you need to consider of automated updates to parts and information, and how do you revalidate and how do you redeliver changed information. Alongside the ASD standards, and the S series, by the way, is ASD led. So whereas S1000D itself is between the 3 partners, all of the rest of the S series come under ASD directly. But aside from that, then we are using open global standards. So, World Wide Web Consortium, XML, HTML, SGML, HTML mainly for delivery. And I'm sure you'll have heard of things like IETP's Interactive Electronic Technical Publications, where you are delivering your content to somebody's screen, whether that's a computer or a tablet. We use standards graphics, so things like JPEGs, TIFFs, GIFs are all able to go into S1000D. They're not necessarily ideal. Ideally, we normally point people towards CGM, a computer graphics metafile. Computer graphics metafiles use vector-based images, so the image can be scaled without degrading quality. All of those previous three use what's known as a raster image, where the image is made up of literally individual dots of color. And so the more you zoom in, the more you see the dots and the boundaries between them. SVG on the end there is, it's been around for a fair while in terms of the World Wide Web. And it's similar to CGM in that it's a vector-based graphic, but it has more capability in terms of shading and color display. CGM is ideal really for line drawings, parts illustrations, component illustrations. SVG is much better suited if you want to do color or sort of 3D rendering type images. SVG is currently being ratified by S1000D. The tools that we've got, we are already using SVG. We work very closely with Larson out in the States, and Larson are involved very closely with S1000D in determining and ratifying those standards. So we're kind of quite confident that whatever we're getting from them as plugins for our tools is going to be compatible with S1000D moving forward. And then we also support things like multimedia, so embedding AVIs, embedding MPEGs, so that the user can actually have video instruction. And that might be sort of some form of stop frame animation, so you could maybe show a part coming apart. It might be some kind of training process where you can actually watch somebody go through and do a procedure. And I've already mentioned the SCORM stuff at the bottom there. So that's probably enough at this level on kind of what S1000D is. I want to have a look at the main concept really that kind of people have to get their head around when they are moving from any other system into S1000D, unless you've done something like DITA already, where DITA also breaks information down into sort of logical reusable blocks, and we talk about having DITA maps and so on, then S1000D really is quite different to any other form of publication production where you generally produce an entire publication. So we have this concept of data containers. I've already mentioned that the data is mandated to be in SGML or XML, and these days pretty much we're talking XML. And so that is marked up in our text stream. So I've talked about the tags. Tags might identify things like paragraphs, lists, figures. Now, figure, obviously the figure itself isn't text, so we have to refer to that as what's known as an entity. So the figure still sits as a separate file, but it's referenced inside our document. And we want things like, obviously, cross-references, both internally within a document, see figure 2, see table 5, but also between our different blocks of content. So I might want to see something that's in a different area. These data containers are known as data modules. And what S1000D does is it provides lots of different types of data module, depending what the type of content is going to be. The main two that you will come across are descriptive and procedural, and they are pretty much as it sounds. So a descriptive data module will contain a description of the item that you're writing about. A procedural data module will contain some kind of procedural steps to carry out some form of action. So that might be a maintenance action, it might be a removal or an installation action or a test or whatever. And generally the procedural one will have a series of steps written into it. Now, despite the fact that I've mentioned we've gone all the way back to 1.6, probably 30 plus years ago now, and SGML and XML and all the changes, the essential structure has not really changed. Those descriptive and procedural data modules were the very earliest types that were ever created, and they are still around now. Obviously, they have different content. They have more content available than the early types, but even down to how the main building blocks are put together hasn't essentially changed over all those years. What we have done is we've added different data module types to meet emerging needs. So back at Change 6, there literally was just those two types. By the time we got to issue 4, and I must admit, I think there's a couple more in issue 5. I didn't do a count, but in issue 4 there were 22 different types. Some of those are very similar. So, for example, a crew data module can have, if you like, almost a mix of descriptive and procedural. It can have steps in it. So it might be a flight crew checklist where people are checking through the items in the cockpit, or it might be a description of how the system works. And then there's a whole load of others there for various different specialist items. You can broadly break them down into two different areas. We have data types. These are the ones that actually contain our content, if you like. And then we have the management types. And the management ones are the ones that enable us to do lots more clever stuff with our data other than just having one data module containing a bit of content. Applicability, we're not going to cover too much about applicability over these 4 lectures because it's a large and complex subject in its own right. But what applicability allows us to do is basically have alternate versions of content, either as side-by-side data modules, so we in effect can swap out an entire data module, or even in line within a data module where we have product variations, and it might be that we have different customer options that, you know, customer A has a basic system, customer B has a more advanced system. We can build that core content into the same data module and differentiate it between by using applicability. And so that differentiation can be done at delivery time, either at delivery of the data module from our management system to the customer, so we can in fact strip out the stuff that we don't want, or we can actually do it at runtime. So the user, for example, one good example is where an aircraft might have a modification. And so the user can say, I'm working on an aircraft that's pre-mod, only show me the pre-mod information. Another person might be working on an aircraft that's post-mod, only wants to see the post-mod information. And that can go as deep as your parts lists, your tools, your spares, your supplies, all the way through the system. So it's a very powerful system, but it is complex to build in the first place. And actually, we have 3 parts to the whole applicability system. There's the ACT, as it's called, the applicability cross-reference table right at the top. We also have a product cross-reference table and a, if I can see it, the I think it's not on that list. There's a third one called the conditions cross-reference table, which isn't actually on that list. And those 3 data modules make up the control and management system for your applicability. We have some specific data module types for our business rules. One of them is known as the BREX data module, the Business Rules Exchange, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then there's another data module where we can specifically write about the business decisions that we've made for our project, and we can write those down and manage and maintain the business decisions in a data module. There's a couple here in the middle, the data dispatch note and the data module list. The data dispatch note is, if you like, a delivery note. So if you are creating S1000D for a customer, then when you send out your potentially hundreds, if not thousands of data modules and all their attendant illustrations, you can create a data dispatch note so that the receiving person knows that they've got all the right content at the right version. The data module list is something that you create for your project so that you have a guide as to what data modules you actually need to create. And I'll talk more about data module list again in a minute as well. And then we have things like the publication module, which is in effect a catalog file so that we can publish in a traditional style to a traditional manual, but pulling together all these different data modules. So we have all these different types available, and they are, pretty straightforward. A publication module is there to publish a set of data modules. But what I see a lot, and what, again, in the long run really harms projects, and it's a good one to have in the back of your mind, is using the wrong type of data module for the wrong information. So there is a specific parts list data module where you can pull information. It's designed to pull information from S1000M to transform it into the illustrated parts, and that can then go into your product. And it can not only be used for displaying information on screen, but it could, for example, be used to drive a parts management system, like for ordering spares and so on. Now, if you've just used a descriptive data module and you've just used tables or lists for your parts, then you've suddenly lost that functionality. It's like doing a procedure, but doing it in a descriptive data module using a numbered list rather than actually using steps in a procedure. A lot of the tools out there these days, particularly for the electronic delivery, have the ability to recognize steps. And so if somebody is working perhaps hands-free, they might be using some kind of augmented reality visor. They have their instructions displayed on the screen in front of them. They have both their hands free to work on the procedure that they're doing, and the system knows that they can click step by step by step, and they complete the step and then tell the system to move on, whether it's a voice command or an eye command, to move on to the next step. Now, if you've done that in a numbered list, that step functionality is not going to work. So though it might be simple to just have a descriptive data module and a numbered list, you're potentially causing problems down the line. So one of the things for breaking it down into all these data containers is that we try and have both a granularity of information that's easy to maintain, and also so that we don't duplicate information. Classic one is figures. I might have a figure that shows a display of part of my aircraft or part of my motor or whatever it is I'm documenting. That one figure is probably relevant in lots of different places in my content. So if I can create it once and maintain it and just use it by reference in all the places I need it, then I've saved myself, both a big editing task in terms of maintaining lots of different versions of the same illustration, and also a checking task, because every time I need to update it, I can update it once and have it updated in all those different places. You can see there is a flip side to that, is I need to know where it's used in all those different places. And this comes back to some of the Cstb functionality and being able to manage things and know where the relationships are between my different items. But that's the kind of stuff that we can do with modern database functionality quite easily. Some data modules might be by nature tiny. If it's a remove procedure and it simply says go and see this data module for the remove procedure and then go and see this data module for the reinstall procedure, that might be the entire thing, and we reference out to different parts. I've seen other data modules where, particularly in descriptive, because the author wants to write more of a holistic overview, that we end up with several, in effect, in old school terms, would have been several pages of data, even a chapter worth of data. If you like, my gut guidance is to try and keep them as small as possible and to break them down, because they're easier to maintain in the long run. As long as you've got a good management system, it's easier to just go and open up a small snippet of content. You're probably less likely to be impacted by lots of different changes. If I've written, going back to aircraft, my background, if I've written a chapter-sized data module on the description of, say, the aircraft electrical system, every time there's a change anywhere in the electrical system, I'm going to have to edit that chapter. Whereas if I've broken it down into sections, even at a basic level into, say, DC and AC electrics, and then further down to that into systems and so on, then if the change only affects one part of my electrical system, I only have one small data module to edit and update and reissue. The flip side is that we can end up with lots and lots of data files. And so we need some way of actually managing those. And so we have a codification. Now, I'm not going to go into the full details of codification in this. We'll talk a little bit about it when we do the authoring talk next week. But we do a full sort of S1000D course where we go into all the details of how codification and so on is done. But the bottom line of having all of these data modules and the attendant image files, which are, by the way, image files, if you're not aware, are known as ICNs, information control numbers. The project can end up with lots and lots and lots of these little files floating around. And we also have two unique systems. So S1000D identifies the parts of your project by what's known as the standard numbering system, the SNS. That identifies right down to component or even subcomponent level the parts that you need to write about. We then also have what's known as the information code. And the information code tells us what we're writing about. So it might be that I'm writing a description, or I'm writing a clean procedure, or a test procedure, or an install procedure. So what we find is that we almost end up, if you like, a multiplication factor. For every item in our SNS breakdown, we might have several information codes that we need to generate for that one item. And the final thing with S1000D is it also assumes that we never throw anything away. We keep all the old issues of data modules in our system. Some of them may still be relevant for older platforms, for example, pre-modification states. And they're also kept there for governance and history purposes. We could end up with lots and lots and lots of files. And so although you can manage that in a traditional file system, it can get complicated, particularly if you've then got lots of projects with lots of different crossover between them and so on. The other part of this, of course, is down to governance. With so many files floating around, we need a control mechanism to make sure that what's actually issued to the end user is validated. Somebody with the right authority has signed it off and approved it, and that only those approved items are actually released as part of the documentation package, whether that's to our customer or to our end user. And that's where that DDN comes in, that data delivery note, so that when we are doing those deliveries, everything is documented. And it's not just documented down with the data module codification, but actually within the data module, we can also store information about the issue, the date, the verification status. And that leads me on to the next part. So every data module contains two major structures. And I'm not going to go into the kind of the detail of the XML and so on, but basically we have the management data at the beginning, and then we have the content. And the content is quite straightforward. And the content will change depending on our data module type, whether we're descriptive, procedure, or whatever. But the management data, by and large, is the same for every data module, whatever type it is. There's a few minor exceptions with some of the specialist management types, but by and large, the ID and status is the same. And it's called the ID and status because it has, again, two parts, identification and status. The identification has our unique codification. And so we identify the component or subcomponent that we're talking about, and as I mentioned, the type of information that we're talking about. It also contains the data module title, and this is just our literal plain language name for what we're writing about, and it contains the issue status, both an issue number and an issue date. And we also have a concept of in-work numbering. The rest of the status information then contains things like we have a big chunk of what we call data restrictions. So, who can receive this data module? Where can it be released? What's the export controls? What's the destruction controls? For some of our information, that's not really relevant. There may be no restrictions. All we might need is a copyright statement. However, if we get into talking about things like ITAR, where actually if we send the wrong information to the wrong people, it could be a very, very costly mistake at a company level. Then it's really important to have that information baked into the data module itself. And we also put in there links to our applicability, links to our breaks. We can have in there information about what updates were included in that version of the data module. And finally, we have the verification information. And again, more of this when we look at the authoring and the management side, but S1000D allows for 2 stages of verification. And it's kind of down to the business how it decides to use those, but they're there and they can be used, for example, for internal peer reviews, for external engineering reviews, or maybe for customer acceptance reviews. So just going to have a brief whiz through. Now that's kind of the, if you like, as deep as I want to go in terms of S1000D and how it actually works and how it breaks down. So I'm going to have a kind of a bit of a high level think about some of the concepts of S1000D itself, and the things that you need to consider at a project level if you're starting out in S1000D. I absolutely think training is one of the most important things, and we're not just talking about the authors, can they write S1000D, but also for the decision makers, the stakeholders, the managers, that they understand what the implications of getting into S1000D are. There are benefits and there are things that will also cost time and effort to do right. And there are also things that if you do them wrong, or if you make mistakes or you go down the wrong path, can be even more costly. Do you need tools? Depending what you're doing, do you need this common source database? Do you need authoring tools? Do you need Brex checking tools, publishing tools? Did you even know there were so many tools? And when you're setting up a project, what things do you need to do with first? When do we need to sort out this standard numbering system breakdown? When do we need to write our Brex? Do we have to create a data module requirements list? And if we do, how do we create that? How do we get from this S&S and these information codes to decide what we're actually going to author? When do we use our data dispatch notes, and so on and so on? And then converting existing data. You know, unless you are starting a brand new project and somebody said, right, we're going to do it from scratch in S1000D, then probably one of the most important things is that you don't throw away all that value you have in your existing data, and that you find both a simple, cost-effective way of converting it, but also a safe way, because you've got to guarantee that what goes into any sort of conversion pipeline comes out the other end with all the same requirements and information as went in. Finally, one of the most important things, but one that can get missed in terms of a project, is understanding your deliverable. Because if you are working, you know, on behalf of somebody else, if you're delivering a project to them, then what are they expecting of you? If they just want paper that happens to look like the S1000D format, then what's your quickest route to producing that? Alternatively, if you're delivering electronically and they just want your XML data modules, do you even need to worry about paper or PDF or anything else? Do you need that at some stage as part of your checking process, and so on? And, you know, so how does that fit in? Where does it work? So from a training point of view, authors, clearly, if they've not worked in structured language before, they need to understand even the kind of basic rules of how do I work in XML? What kind of tools do I need? Specifically from an S1000D point of view, then they need to understand the S&S and the way that things are codified. They will need to know what the business rules are, and how that they need to author and write the contents so that they maintain compliance with the business rules. And we can do stuff with the Brex, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if they can write and author in the first place, it saves rework from mistakes. I mentioned briefly at the bottom there STE. STE is Simplified Technical English. A lot of S1000D projects call for Simplified Technical English, and it's a way of writing and way of using the English language that even if English isn't your first or even your second language, it presents a reduced vocabulary and a reduced dictionary that therefore is easy to learn and removes any ambiguity in the way that information is presented and the tasks are described. And so STE might be a requirement. And again, there are tools out there that can help you in terms of looking at the language that's been written, looking at the semantics and saying, is that actually what you meant? Or have you used a word that isn't in our allowed dictionary and so on? But it still needs a degree of training for the authors themselves in the first place. And that's on top of knowing your normal business processes, how your authoring rules and your house style work, how to, for example, run the review process and so on. From a management decision point of view, then if you understand the principles of S1000D, and our normal introduction to S1000D course is actually for managing decision makers is kind of a day long. It's not just an hour session. So you can kind of gauge the depth that we're going into here. But certainly when it comes to the information management and governance, these are the things from a business perspective that will bite you if you get them wrong. So yes, output requirements kind of come on the end of that. But from a cost perspective, there's the initial setup of the staff and the tools and so on that are going to be required to make that S1000D. But the big costs, the kind of the loss costs, if you like, is the cost of rework and the cost of mistakes. Heaven forbid any of us is ever involved in incorrectly documenting something that leads to some kind of accident, but it does happen. Even in my days in Handling Squadron, we suffered some printing failures, and it was down to a misunderstanding of the way that PDF was handling images and handling color layers within images. And we produced some graphs for, back at the time, a British military helicopter that actually, when he was operating in a cold, high-level condition, so in the mountains of Norway, and everything's going on in Russia at the moment, Finland, Sweden, all come into that category, the graphs actually put the helicopter in a dangerous position. Luckily, the person that found it, who was operating in that position, was a very experienced instructor and looked at the graphs and realized that things weren't right. And so it was called in, it was reprocessed, and we worked out what had gone wrong. If that had been a junior pilot and he'd not picked up the mistake, that could have led to a crash, which at worst could have been, at least could have been the loss of the helicopter. At worst could have been the loss of life. And so those kind of mistakes are massive on the business, and therefore your governance and your process that leads to that validation of information is absolutely critical. Quick think about tools, and again, the next couple of weeks we're going to look at some authoring stuff next week, and we're going to look at some management stuff the week after. So I won't go into too much depth, but you've got to produce XML if you're going to do S1000D, and so your tools have to handle XML. You could literally get Notepad and open it up and you could sit and write tags, but it's not going to be productive and it's not going to be very easy to read. And so you need something that helps your authors write the right stuff in the first place. We want to be compliant with S1000D, and we want to do, we want to make life as easy as possible. So if I'm inserting an image into my content, I want to be able to ideally pull that image from a list and just say, right, insert it, boom, done. I don't want to have to write some code or, create some structure to put an image in and hunt for it on my file system. I mentioned some of the S2000, S3000 stuff. Well, S1000D has the concept of common information repositories, which is a data module that can contain lists. It could be a list of spares, a list of tools, it could be a list of warnings and cautions. I could have had my legal team go through my warnings and decide exactly what the wording is so that there is no ambiguity. I want to make sure that when I insert that warning into my content, I don't change the words around or mistype something or mistype a value. And so if they're inserted from a common repository, again, it takes the pressure off me as an author because I'm not going to get it wrong, and I can just pick it from a list. And in the future maintenance of my document, then if those things are updated and changed, that change can be automatically applied to my data module as well. So the CSTB, yeah, we could use a file system. I think you will find with anything but the smallest of projects, and when I say a small project, I'm talking about maybe a third-party manufacturer that's producing a component for a tier 2 or a tier 1 manufacturer, and therefore they've only got a tiny bit of documentation to do just for their component. Anything beyond that, when you start looking at multiple projects, multiple components across those projects, then really that's where the CSTB comes into its own. And as well as just being this bucket of data, then actually it should help with your workflows, and it should do all that change tracking, and it should do all that governance support. One of the things that S1000D isn't particularly detailed on is how you produce your graphics. It gives guidance if you want to produce graphics that are going to go on paper as to what size they should be, and it gives guidance about things like what type of line weights you should use, what type of fonts and sizes you should use, and how you should do your callouts. But beyond that, there isn't a huge amount of guidance in there. And so again, does your CSTB support your graphics? Does it manage the links between your graphics and your data modules? And really, you should be managing them in the same way. Essentially, you might be using your system to do your publishing, to do your output, to do your delivery. And again, those are things that we're going to look at kind of in week 3. So I won't go into that too much now. The biggest thing is with all these tool sets out there, and there are so many different levels and sizes and capabilities of CSTB, of authoring tool, of management, of Brex checker, of publication, everything. You need to understand what your project inputs, outputs, and business processes are. Once you have worked out from an S1000D perspective what your project requires, then think about the tool set and make sure that the tool set meets your requirements. Don't go out to some vendor that's desperate to sell you their monster CSTB with all its content management and all its hooks and bells and whistles, because if you don't need all of that, you've just lumbered yourself with a big learning curve, and you've ended up with a whole load of redundant IT because you only need a tiny fraction of what that tool set can actually do. In terms of the project setup itself, again, it kind of depends very much what you're producing and who you're producing it. If you're the prime contractor, then that's great, because you can decide all those factors. But if you're producing it for someone else, then they'll often dictate a lot of the requirements, and particularly things like the Brex, the codification, stuff like that. A lot of projects, the prime will define the top level of all its codification and so on, but it might be that you lower down are still responsible for codifying the areas that you're actually working on specifically. I'm just looking at the time and checking that I don't overrun too much. I've got a couple more things just to talk about. So with your project, you need to understand what you're supplying and how it's going to be produced, and ensure that that drives both the team that you put in place in terms of authors and illustrators and managers. Your TechPubs manager may not necessarily need to be an author, a technical author, but he needs to understand the project requirements. He needs to understand how S1000D works so that he can be running that codification and those verification stages and so on. I mentioned at the beginning that even the guide, the PDF guide for S1000D is 3,500 pages. Now, there's no way that anyone coming new to S1000D can work through those 3,500 pages and understand S1000D. It's like I did it in a previous talk. Actually, I used the image of Neo in the Matrix having a download directly into his brain, and suddenly he understood S1000D. Well, it doesn't quite work like that in the real world, unfortunately. S1000D can do an awful lot, and it has a huge amount of complexity. And I've talked about things like applicability and stuff. But if you don't need those bits, you don't have to do it all. Do the bits that you need, because that will keep it a lot simpler and it will make it a lot easier to implement. Even if, for example, you just start implementing your project with your base version, and in the future, as you add different versions and as modifications come along, then you start adding applicability and you build that model as you go. But keep it simple, because that will make it much easier to implement, much more cost effective to implement, and it makes it a lot easier, if you like, to bring everyone along for the ride. Your authors, your managers, and everyone else. So there's an awful lot there in just an hour's space of time. And as I say, if we're doing this intro to S1000D as our typical course, even for managers and so on, it's a day-long course. And when we do our authoring courses, they are 2 days long for the authors, just to understand the S1000D bit. And then there's a further element on top of that for doing the whole structure and editing in, say, FrameMaker or Arbortext or whatever. So in an hour, we've scratched the surface. And there's other stuff that we will cover in more depth. As I say, in the coming, we've got 3 more sessions. But I think that's about as much as I want to run through today. To support this talk, we have put together an S1000D 101, which is just an ebook that you can download. And along with the recording for this session, I will send out a link that you can sign up and download that ebook as well. But I think for now, that the end of just over an hour, the dreaded questions.